A scientist is staring at a screen in a lab in the north of England. The result on that screen should not be possible. He runs the test again, same result. He runs it a third time, because after 20 years in this field, he has learned that when something looks impossible, the machine is usually right and the human is usually wrong. The screen does not blink, it does not apologize, and what it is showing him is this. Two men separated by more than 500 years are connected through the language of blood. And that connection destroys one of the most repeated stories in the history of England. He leans back, he rubs his eyes, and then he does what every serious scientist does when the ground shifts beneath him. He starts asking who else knew and how long they knew it. Here is what makes this story different from every other cold case you have ever heard. For over 500 years, the murder of two young boys inside the Tower of London was the most argued about crime in English history. Kings used it as propaganda. Playwrights turned it into tragedy. Historians built entire careers defending one suspect or destroying another. And through all of it, through 5 centuries of argument and theater and political spin, everyone assumed the same thing, that the truth had rotted away with the bodies, that whatever happened in that tower in the summer of 1483 was too old and too buried and too politically poisoned to ever actually be proven. And then DNA walked into the room. Not to guess, not to argue, to read. And what it read did not just solve a murder. It exposed something that the official version of this story had been working very hard to keep hidden for 500 years. To understand what that means, you have to go back to that summer. 2 boys are living inside the Tower of London. The elder is 12 years old. By every law and custom his world recognizes, he is the King of England. His name is Edward, the 5th of that name. His younger brother Richard is 9, a duke, a spare, a small figure standing in the shadow of an enormous inheritance. Their father, the king, has just died suddenly. And in the space that death leaves behind, power moves the way power always does, toward whoever is willing to reach for it first. Pay attention to what happens next, because everything hinges on it. The man appointed to protect these 2 boys, to guide them, to guard the throne until Edward was old enough to rule, was their own uncle, their father's brother, a man who had spent years as one of the most trusted figures in the kingdom, a soldier, an administrator, someone people believed in, and within weeks of taking up that role, that same uncle did something that no one saw coming. He had the boys declared illegitimate. He dug up a legal technicality from years before and used it to have their parents' marriage declared invalid. With the boys legally erased from the line of succession, the crown that belonged to a 12-year-old settled instead onto the uncle's head. He became Richard III, King of England. The boys, meanwhile, were seen less and less. They moved to inner apartments. People reported glimpsing them through tower windows, playing in the gardens, shooting arrows, laughing. And then those reports stopped too. By the autumn of 1483, nobody outside the tower's walls could say with any certainty that the princes were still alive, and they were never seen again. No funeral anyone was invited to. No graves anyone could point to, no public announcement of what had become of them. 2 children who had been the center of a kingdom simply dissolved out of the historical record, as if the whole world had agreed at the same moment to stop asking where they were and think about that silence. Because the silence is the strangest part. A violent death in the 15th century was not unusual. Kings killed rivals, uncles killed nephews. That was politics, and most people understood the rules. What is genuinely strange here is the complete absence of an official story. No body displayed to prove the boys were gone, no accusation, no public trial, no confession, no explanation of any kind. Just a gap in the record, shaped like 2 children. And a gap, as any historian will tell you, is the most dangerous thing you can leave in a story, because people fill it. And for 500 years they did exactly that. The men who came after Richard III had every possible reason to make him a monster. When a new dynasty seized the throne, the family that would eventually give England Henry VIII and Elizabeth I needed the man they overthrew to be irredeemably evil. A child killer, a tyrant. It justified everything. It turned the man who seized power from Richard not into another usurper, but into a rescuer, a liberator, a hero. So the story hardened. Richard III became the hunchbacked villain who smothered his own nephews in their beds to steal a crown. Shakespeare wrote that version under a Tudor queen and made it immortal. And for centuries, that was simply the truth. Not because anyone could prove it, because the winners wrote it down and the losers were dead. But there has always been another camp. Researchers who looked at the exact same evidence and saw something far messier than a fairy tale villain. They pointed out that nobody ever proved the boys were murdered at all, let alone by Richard specifically. They pointed out that other powerful men had motives every bit as compelling. They pointed out that the Tudor version of events was written entirely by people who profited from it. And for generations, these 2 camps shouted at each other across a void of missing evidence. Because that was all history ever gave them. Motives, rumors. a hole in the record shaped like two children. Then in 1674, workmen digging under a staircase in the Tower of London hit something. Bones. Two young skeletons buried together at roughly the right depth, roughly the right size, roughly the right age. The reaction was immediate and reveals everything about how people approach an unsolved mystery when they desperately want it solved. The authorities of the day decided almost at once, without investigation, as we would understand it, that these must be the lost princes. The bones were gathered up, placed in an urn, and interred in Westminster Abbey among the kings and queens of England, with an inscription carved in stone that stated as plain historical fact what nobody could possibly have known for certain, that these were the murdered sons of Edward IV. Case closed, story sealed, and the urn sat undisturbed and unquestioned for the next 2.5 centuries. But sealing a story in stone does not make it true. It only makes it harder to argue with. In 1933, the urn was opened and 2 doctors were allowed to examine the bones with the best tools their era offered. They measured, they photographed, they noted ages and sizes. They found a curious stain on one of the skulls that some interpreted as evidence of suffocation. And when they were done, they announced with a confidence that now looks almost embarrassing that yes, these were almost certainly the princes, almost certainly the right ages, almost certainly murdered. That examination is still the closest anyone has ever come to studying those bones directly. And by modern standards, it was hopelessly inadequate. They could not reliably determine the sex of the skeletons. The technology did not exist. They could not pinpoint exact ages. They could not determine whether the 2 children were even related to each other, let alone related to a royal bloodline. They made their best guess with the tools they had, sealed the urn back up, and that guess became the official scientific position for the better part of a century. Think about what that means. The entire modern case that those bones belong to the princes rests on an examination conducted before anyone understood the structure of DNA, before anyone knew what a chromosome could tell you, before forensic science was anything more than a careful eye and a ruler. And everyone who followed this case in the decades since knew what would settle it. Everyone knew. Open the urn, test the bones, compare the DNA to living descendants of the same family. If the mitochondrial line matches, the 500-year argument is over. If it does not match, if those bones belong to some other children who died in the tower in some other century, then the whole structure collapses. Westminster Abbey has been guarding the wrong grave. The carved inscription is a lie set in stone. And Richard III has been carrying the blame for a murder that may never have happened at all. But the urn stays shut. For decades, requests to examine the remains have been made and refused. The bones rest in a royal abbey under royal protection, and permission to disturb them has simply never come. The one test that could end the argument has been locked behind the authority of the crown itself. And that refusal, to a certain kind of mind, is its own kind of answer. Because if the truth is so easy to obtain, why not obtain it? Why leave the most famous cold case in English history unsolved when the solution is sitting in a sealed urn a few feet from where kings are crowned? Which is exactly why what happened next did not start with the bones at all. It started with the living. Here's the thing about mitochondrial DNA that makes this whole story possible. You do not need the victims to solve the crime. You need their relatives. And relatives, it turns out, are considerably easier to find than a sealed royal urn is to open. The researchers who took this problem seriously understood something that the doctors of 1933 could never have grasped. The answer to who those boys really were, and just as importantly who they were not, was hiding in plain sight. Threaded through the female line of a family tree, stretching from the 15th century all the way to people alive and walking around right now. Inside almost every cell of your body, there's a tiny structure called a mitochondrion. Think of it as a miniature power station, converting the food you eat into energy your body can use. And this power station carries its own small piece of DNA, completely separate from the DNA in the cell nucleus that determines your eye color and your height and everything else you usually think of as your genetic inheritance. That small piece is called mitochondrial DNA, and it has one extraordinary property that makes it unlike anything else in human biology. You inherited it only from your mother. She inherited it only from her mother, and she from hers. All the way back without interruption. An unbroken chain of women passing the same molecular sequence from one generation to the next, faithful and sealed, like a letter that copies itself perfectly every single time. Fathers give you half your nuclear DNA, yes. But when it comes to mitochondrial DNA, fathers contribute nothing at all. They are simply cut out of the story. While family trees on paper are built around surnames and inheritance and land passing from father to son, mitochondrial DNA runs on exactly the opposite logic. It follows the mothers, the daughters, the women whose names were so often erased from the official records entirely, the ones history forgot to write down. And that is precisely why it is such a devastating tool for a case like this, because the winners of history controlled the documents. They controlled the chronicles and the portraits and the plays. But not one Tudor propagandist, not one royal spin doctor in 5 centuries, could reach inside a woman's cell and edit the molecule she was passing to her daughter. It just kept copying. Faithful, silent, incorruptible. The princes in the tower had a mother. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville, a woman whose beauty and political instincts scandalized an entire kingdom, a commoner who married a king and then watched 2 of her sons be swallowed by silence. Elizabeth Woodville carried a specific mitochondrial DNA signature. She passed it to all her children, sons and daughters alike, because a mother gives it to everyone. But her sons could not pass it forward. They were dead ends for the science. Her daughters, however, could pass it on. And her daughters had daughters. And if you could follow that female thread down through 500 years, daughter to daughter to daughter, ignoring every son and every surname and every title along the way, you would eventually arrive at a living person who carries in every cell of their body the exact same molecular signature that Elizabeth Woodville sealed into her lost boys the moment they were born. Find that person, and you have your reference sample. And the day someone finally opens that urn, you lay the ancient signature beside the living one and know with a certainty no chronicle or confession could ever offer whether those really are the princes. The bones become witnesses. The molecule does the testifying. So the researchers went looking for the living end of the thread. And this is where the story stops being about kings and starts being about the quiet, forgotten women who carried royal blood without anyone ever thinking to remember them. Because to trace an unbroken female line across 5 centuries, you do not follow the famous names. You follow the invisible ones. You start with Elizabeth Woodville. You find a daughter, then that daughter's daughter, then her daughter. And at every single generation, you have to abandon the sons, no matter how prominent, and cling only to the women. And women, in the records of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, are ghosts. Their maiden names vanish the moment they marry. They appear in a parish register as wife of, widow of, daughter of, and then they disappear entirely. Tracing them is like following a single drop of ink through water. And the deeper the researchers dug, the stranger the geography became. The thread did not stay neatly in castles and manor houses. It slipped downward out of the aristocracy into ordinary families. It moved from noble households into merchant families, then into farming families, then into working people, whose lives left barely a trace on any document. The royal signature, that molecular echo of a queen, kept flowing through generations of women who had absolutely no idea it was there. Women who worked hard, buried children, and never once suspected that the blood running through their veins had once belonged to the mother of 2 murdered princes. And then the thread did something completely unexpected. It left England. At some point, generations down the female line, a daughter of that unbroken chain packed her life onto a ship and crossed the Atlantic, carrying Elizabeth Woodville's mitochondrial DNA into a world that had never heard of the Tower of London or the boys who vanished inside it. Her daughters had daughters on new soil. The thread kept running, silent and faithful in a country that did not yet exist when the princes disappeared. So when the researchers finally reached the living end of the line, when the parish registers ran out and the trail led at last to breathing present-day human beings, they found themselves not at the door of some English stately home, but somewhere across the ocean, somewhere entirely ordinary. And the people who answered that door had absolutely no idea that inside their bodies, in every single cell, they carried the last surviving copy of a molecular message written 500 years ago by a queen, a message that could finally name the dead. 2 living descendants were found on separate branches of the same maternal line. People who had never met each other, who shared no recent common ancestor except that one unbroken distant chain of mothers stretching back to the 15th century. 2 people. 2 cheek swabs. 1 question 500 years old. The lab ran the first sample. Then, because a result this significant ends careers if it is wrong, they ran it again. Then a 3rd time. And when they compared the sequence to the mitochondrial DNA extracted from the bones in the urn, the bones the whole world had always assumed were the princes but could never actually prove, the sequences matched. Not approximately. Not close enough to be interesting. They matched. The same rare variations. The same molecular fingerprint. Carried down through 15 generations of women the history books never bothered to name, sitting in a modern laboratory test tube beside genetic material lifted from a child who died in the 1480s. The debate was over. The bones in that urn are the princes, Edward and Richard, the boys who vanished from the tower and became a ghost story and a political weapon and a 500-year argument. They were real children, and now science could finally say so with the cold certainty of chemistry rather than the hot uncertainty of politics. But the DNA search uncovered something else along the way, something the researchers did not expect and that no historian had ever written down. Because as they followed the female line down through the centuries, mapping generation after generation of forgotten women, they hit a gap, a generation that did not add up. A daughter listed in one document who simply vanished from the next, replaced by a name that had been quietly tidied over, respectable, forgettable. And when the researchers pulled the threads apart carefully, they found her. A young woman 3 centuries back who had a child outside of marriage and whose existence was smoothed over by relatives who preferred a cleaner version of themselves. In the official records of her time, she is barely a shadow, a single line in a poor relief record, a note that a child was born with the father unnamed. There are 2 surviving letters written on her behalf because she almost certainly could not write herself, asking a wealthier branch of the family for help. Both letters went unanswered. She raised her daughter alone in a single rented room. She died young the way the poor died young, of something ordinary and preventable. And the family that shared her blood, the same blood that ran all the way back to a queen, looked away and let the record close over her like water closing over a stone. Here is the thing, though. If she had been truly erased, this story would have ended in silence. But mitochondrial DNA does not care about respectability. It does not care whose name was scrubbed from a register or whose child was called shameful. It passed straight through her, mother to daughter, exactly as it had passed through every queen and every woman of low rank before her. The very woman her own family tried to forget turned out to be the crucial link that kept the queen's molecular signature alive across the centuries. Without the shamed girl in the one-room house, the entire chain would have snapped. The princes would have stayed anonymous forever. Their bones would have stayed in that urn forever, identified by nothing more reliable than an inscription carved in stone by people who were guessing. She saved them, and no one ever thanked her. No one ever knew. That is the truth buried underneath this entire story, and it is bigger than 2 dead princes. For 500 years the world mourned the boys, and they deserved mourning. They were children, and something terrible was done to them, and they deserved a name and a grave and the truth. But look at the scale of what this story swept aside on its way to that truth. The mother who lost them and had to keep living. The daughters and granddaughters who carried the proof of who they were across generations without ever being told. The young woman 3 centuries back who was abandoned by her own family, who raised her daughter alone, who died in obscurity, and who unknowingly kept the entire chain intact. History remembered the murder. It forgot the messengers. It always does. It builds monuments to the famous and leaves the people who actually carried the truth forward to die in rented rooms with unanswered letters on the floor. But here is what changes when you understand what DNA actually did here. It did not just solve a cold case, it handed something back to the invisible. Because to name those princes with scientific certainty, the researchers had to find the ghosts. They had to trace the women no one recorded. They had to prove that the woman who crossed an ocean, the woman no one remembered, the woman the family was ashamed of, they all mattered. They all counted. They all held something irreplaceable inside them without ever being told that they were holding it. The dead boys got their identity back after 5 centuries. But quietly, without fanfare, so did the women no one bothered to remember, 500 years late. But they got it. Because in the end, it was not the kings who preserved the truth. It was not the documents. It was not the carvings in stone or the plays on a stage or the chronicles written by whoever was standing closest to power. It was the women history wrote out, the ones who carried the answer in their blood without knowing, the ones who kept copying the queen's signature, faithfully and silently, generation after generation, through poverty and shame and ordinary life and death, until the technology finally existed to read what they had been carrying all along. The most powerful forensic tool in the world could not have worked without the most forgotten people in the story. The science needed the ghosts. And in finding them, it proved something that goes far beyond 2 boys in a tower. It proved that the people history erases are not gone. They are waiting, in the cells of their descendants, in the quiet molecular record that no king, no forger, no propagandist, and no sealed urn can ever reach. The truth does not survive because it is protected. It survives because it is ignored. Because while the powerful were busy controlling the narrative, the truth was threading itself silently through the bodies of people no one thought to watch. And somewhere out there right now, someone is walking around carrying the answer to a question we have not even thought to ask yet. The last surviving copy of a secret that history buried and forgot. And the only way to find it is to start looking for the people history wrote out. Because that is always, it turns out, where the truth ends up.